All right, so imagine being able to like fine-tune a ventilator, for each patient and minimize lung damage.
Oh,
That's the potential.
that's amazing.
Yeah, of this new research on alveolar mechanics that we're diving into today.
Yay.
We're talking about those tiny air sacs in your lungs,
Uh,
the alveoli, and how they behave during mechanical ventilation.
yeah, it's a pretty revolutionary concept, especially considering how much of what we know about how alveoli actually work comes from animal studies,
Oh, wow.
not humans.
That's right.
Yeah.
Our source is a 2022 article from the Journal of Mechanical Ventilation
Okay.
called Alveolar Mechanics, a new concept in respiratory monitoring. And they're proposing a way to measure something called alveolar compliance and resistance, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, traditionally we've used total tidal volume to calculate lung compliance, but that includes all the air that never even makes it to the alveoli,
Right.
the dead space.
So it's like trying to measure how much a balloon stretches by looking at how much air you're blowing into it, but forgetting that some of that air is just filling up the tube.
Precisely. This article proposes using alveolar tidal volume instead, which focuses on the air that's actually participating in gas exchange.
Okay.
And they're using a technique called volumetric capnography to measure it,
And that's...
which tracks the carbon dioxide in your breath.
So by zeroing in on the alveoli, we could get a much more accurate picture of how they're responding to the ventilator.
Exactly.
But how does this actually translate into protecting the lungs?
So think about it like this alveolar strain is basically how much the alveoli are stretched during ventilation.
Okay.
And too much stretching can cause damage, which is what we call ventilator-induced lung injury, or villi.
So if we can precisely measure alveolar volume, we could adjust the ventilator to prevent overstretching those delicate little air sacs.
Exactly. And the same goes for alveolar stress.
Okay.
Right now, we estimate stress on the lungs using overall pressure measurement.
Right.
But this research suggests that using alveolar tidal volume and trans-alveolar pressure could give us a much more precise reading of what's happening at the alveolar level.
Which means we could potentially tailor tidal volume and beep
Exactly.
the pressure that helps keep the alveoli open to each patient's specific needs.
And there's another fascinating piece to this puzzle.
What's that?
Alveolar resistance.
Okay.
This research proposes a whole new way to calculate it, which could be a game changer for understanding how air is distributed throughout the lungs.
It's wild to think that something so fundamental to breathing has been so poorly understood until now.
I know, right?
But wait, there's more. This article also talks about something called trans-alveolar mechanical power,
Yes.
which is basically the energy transferred from the ventilator to the alveoli themselves.
Right, and studies have shown that too much of this mechanical power can contribute to lung injury.
So if we can accurately measure this power, we could adjust the ventilator to keep it within a safe range, which is amazing when you consider how much we're learning about protecting the lungs from the inside out.
It really is revolutionary, but of course, like with any groundbreaking research, there are some limitations to consider.
Like the fact that this approach relies on two tools, esophageal balloon manometry and volumetric capnography,
Yeah.
that aren't routinely used in clinical practice.
Esophageal balloon manometry helps estimate the pressure in the space between the lungs and the chest wall, which is important for understanding how much pressure the alveoli are actually experiencing.
And volumetric capnography, as we mentioned, is crucial for measuring that all-important alveolar tidal volume.
So while this research is incredibly promising, we need wider adoption of these technologies to truly bring these findings into everyday patient care.
Plus, let's not forget that each alveolus is unique with its own little quirks and behaviors.
Yay.
Even with this new approach, we're still getting a big picture view rather than a perfectly detailed one.
It's a good reminder that the lungs are incredibly complex, and even with these advanced tools, there's still so much more to explore.
Speaking of exploring, the article lays out some exciting directions for future research.
Oh yeah, tell me more. So for future research, for starters, imagine being able to construct trans-alveolar pressure volume curves using technology that's already built into existing ventilators.
Wow.
That would make this information way more accessible to clinicians without needing fancy specialized equipment.
Right. And then there's the challenge of developing even more sophisticated models that can account for the fact that each alveolus is different. It's like trying to map a city where every building has its own unique architecture and foundation.
It's a mind-boggling concept, but the potential payoff is huge. We could get even more precise predictions of how the lungs will respond to ventilation, which could help us personalize those ventilator settings even further and minimize the risk of injury.
And let's not forget, The ultimate goal, finding ways to study alveolar mechanics without needles or invasive procedures. Can you imagine being able to monitor these tiny air sacs in real time at the bedside?
It would be a game changer for how we care for patients on ventilators. We could adjust settings on the fly based on what's actually happening in those individual alveoli. It's like having a microscopic view of the lungs while they're working.
This research is a testament to how much we can learn about the body by zooming in on the tiniest details. But before we get too carried away with the future, let's break down some of the fascinating nuances of how alveoli actually function.
I'm ready. We'll dive deeper into the mechanics of how air moves in and out of those tiny air sacs, and I promise it's much more intricate than you might think.
Okay, so it's easy to forget that there's a whole microscopic world down there orchestrating every inhale and exhale.
Right, and this article dives deep into that world, explaining how air actually moves in and out of the alveoli. It's not just a straightforward in and out process. There are multiple mechanisms at play.
Okay, unpack that for me. What are we talking about here?
Well, you've got convection, which is like the bulk flow of air. Think of it like wind rushing through a canyon.
Okay.
And then you've got diffusion, where gas molecules move from areas of high concentration to low concentration, like scent spreading across a room.
So two totally different ways of moving air working together in the lungs. Intrigued? Tell me more.
So in healthy lungs, most of the volume change actually happens in those peripheral airways, the smaller branches leading to the alveoli.
Okay.
Diffusion takes over when we get to those tiny air sacs.
Well, hold on. This article mentions that things get a lot more complicated in injured lungs.
You're right, and that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
In injured lungs, we see alveoli constantly opening and closing, which disrupts that normal flow of air. And that shift can push the convection diffusion front right into the alveolar space, causing all sorts of problems.
Okay, this is where I need a visual. How can I wrap my head around what's happening at such a microscopic level?
Imagine you're watching a time-lapse video of a busy city. You see traffic flowing smoothly on the main roads, while people meander through smaller streets and into buildings. That's like convection and diffusion working harmoniously in healthy lungs.
I'm with you so far. So what happens when things go haywire in injured lungs?
Now imagine those city streets start randomly closing and reopening, forcing all the traffic to squeeze through smaller, less efficient routes.
No.
Some buildings can't get the supplies they need while others get overloaded. That's what's happening in injured lungs when the alveoli are constantly opening and closing.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy. I can almost picture those poor little alveoli struggling to keep up.
And the article actually cites some incredible animal studies that have managed to capture these alveolar dynamics on video. Researchers have identified 4 distinct mechanisms of how those alveoli fill and empty. It's like a microscopic ballet down there, with each alveolus moving in a slightly different way.
Okay, I have to know, what are these 4 mechanisms? Paint me a picture.
All right, so first you have sequential recruitment and decruitment. Imagine a line of dancers waiting to take the stage. One by one they join in, then exit in a choreographed sequence. That's how some alveoli take turns participating in gas exchange.
And then there's that balloon analogy we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Some alveoli simply inflate and deflate like tiny balloons, changing size but not shape.
So far, so good. What about the other 2 mechanisms?
The third one is a bit more complex. Imagine those dancers changing their size and shape, simultaneously morphing and contorting their bodies in a fluid dance. Some alveoli do that too, adapting to the changing pressures and airflow.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing. And the 4th mechanism?
This one is called crumpling and decrumpling. Imagine a piece of paper being crumpled up, then smoothed out again. Some alveoli exhibit this behavior, their delicate surfaces folding and unfolding with each breath.
Wow, I never imagined so much complexity happening with each breath I take.
And then there's this phenomenon called the pendulum phenomenon. Imagine some of those dancers whispering secrets to each other through small openings in the walls.
By whispering secrets.
Not literally, but the pendulum phenomenon describes air moving between adjacent alveoli through tiny connections called pores of cone.
So the alveoli are not just these isolated little units, they're actually interconnected and sharing air.
Precisely. And all these intricate movements and interactions are happening at a microscopic level. With every breath we take, it's a remarkable symphony of motion.
Given all that complexity, it's even more impressive that the authors are attempting to define alveolar mechanics in a way that could actually help us manage ventilation better.
You're absolutely right. And remember how we talked about alveolar strain and stress earlier? Well, knowing the alveolar tidal volume more accurately could be the key to preventing those issues.
Because overstretching and excessive pressure are those big bad wolves we want to keep away from the alveoli, right?
Exactly. Think of it this way. If you're inflating a balloon, You can feel how much pressure you're applying, but with traditional ventilation, we haven't had that same level of sensitivity for the alveoli.
We've been using a one-size-fits-all approach, when what we really need is a tailor-made solution for each patient.
And that's where this new research comes in. By understanding alveolar mechanics more precisely, we could potentially adjust ventilator settings to keep strain and stress within a safe range for each individual.
So instead of blindly setting tidal volume and PEEP, we could fine-tune them based on real-time information about what's happening in those tiny air sacs.
It would be a game changer, allowing us to personalize a ventilation like never before. And remember that mysterious alveolar resistance we talked about.
Oh yeah, the one we're just starting to understand?
Well, this article argues that calculating it using trans-alveolar pressure and alveolar flow could be crucial for figuring out how air is distributed throughout the lungs.
It's like solving a complex plumbing problem, making sure the air is flowing smoothly and efficiently to all the right places.
And ultimately, this all ties back to that concept of mechanical power.
The energy being transferred from the ventilator to the lungs?
Right, and by using alveolar tidal volume and alveolar elastance, which is basically the opposite of compliance, we can calculate what the authors call trans-alveolar mechanical power.
And the big takeaway here is that this type of mechanical power is specifically targeted to the alveoli, which could help us minimize the risk of injury. It really paints a picture of how we might be able to manage ventilation in a way that's far more personalized and protective of the lungs. But let's be real, we can't just ignore the elephant in the room.
You mean those limitations we touched on?
Exactly. Let's dig into those a bit more. So, okay, we've established that this research is super exciting.
Yeah.
But at DIST, it hinges on tools that aren't exactly standard equipment in every ICU.
Right.
We're talking about esophageal balloon manometry and volumetric capnography.
Yeah.
What's the deal with those?
Well, they're both incredibly valuable for understanding what's happening at the alveolar level. Esophageal balloon manometry, for example, helps us estimate pleural pressure, which is the pressure surrounding the lungs.
So it's like having a pressure gauge tucked right between the lungs and the chest wall, giving us a more accurate reading of how much pressure those alveoli are actually experiencing.
Exactly. And volumetric capnography, as we've already discussed, is crucial for measuring alveolar tidal volume, the amount of air that's actually reaching the alveoli and participating in gas exchange.
It's like finally having the right tools to measure the ingredients in a recipe instead of just eyeballing it and hoping for the best.
That's a great analogy. And the article emphasizes that wider adoption of these technologies is crucial for translating this research into real-world clinical practice.
Yeah, it's like having a cutting-edge map, but no compass to navigate with.
Precisely. And then there's the issue of lung heterogeneity, which we touched on earlier.
Right. The fact that each alveolus is unique, like a snowflake with its own size, shape, and behavior.
And this presents a major challenge for researchers because even with these new methods of calculating alveolar mechanics, we're still getting a global picture rather than a granular view of what's happening in each individual alveolus.
It's like trying to understand the dynamics of a bustling city by looking at it from an airplane.
Yes.
You get the overall layout, but you miss the individual stories unfolding on each street corner.
Exactly. And that's why the authors call for the development of more sophisticated models that can account for this heterogeneity, models that can capture the intricate dance of forces and dynamics at the alveolar level.
So we need models that can zoom in on those individual street corners, so to speak.
Precisely, models that can predict how individual alveoli will respond to different pressures and volumes, helping us personalize ventilation settings with even greater precision.
Like a daunting challenge, but the potential payoff is huge.
Absolutely. Imagine being able to create a virtual map of the lungs with each alveolus meticulously rendered and its behavior accurately predicted. It would revolutionize how we approach ventilation.
Speaking of revolutionizing things, the article also mentions something called the trans-alveolar pressure volume curve. Can you break that down for me?
Sure, you're probably familiar with the traditional pressure volume curve of the respiratory system, which shows how lung volume changes in relation to pressure.
Right.
It gives us valuable information about lung compliance and potential injury.
Right, like how a steeper curve indicates higher compliance, meaning the lungs are easier to inflate.
Exactly. Now, what the authors are proposing is to create a similar curve, but specifically for the alveoli, using trans-alveolar pressure and alveolar volume.
So it's like zooming in on those tiny air sacs and creating a pressure volume curve for each one.
Right.
It would be like having a personalized blueprint for how each alveolus behaves.
And what's really exciting is that the article suggests that some existing ventilators, with a bit of tweaking, might be able to generate these transalveolar pressure volume curves.
No way. So we might not even need fancy new equipment to access this valuable information. It could be right there at our fingertips.
Potentially, it would be a game changer, giving clinicians real-time insights into the mechanical behavior of individual alveoli.
Okay, now you really get me excited. It feels like we're on the verge of a major shift in how we approach ventilation. I agree this research is pushing the boundaries of what we know about respiratory mechanics, and the implications for patient care are immense.
And let's not forget the holy grail of alveolar mechanics, research, finding ways to study it non-invasively and in real time at the bedside.
Ah, yes, the dream. Imagine being able to monitor alveolar dynamics without needles, tubes, or any invasive procedures.
It would be like having X-ray vision for the lungs, allowing us to see those tiny air sacs in action and adjust ventilation settings accordingly.
It's the ultimate goal, and researchers are actively exploring various technologies and approaches to make this dream a reality.
This deep dive has been mind-blowing. We've journeyed from the basic concepts of lung function to the cutting edge of alveolar mechanics. Research uncovering a world of complexity and possibility.
And it all comes back to that fundamental goal, improving the care of patients on mechanical ventilation.
By understanding the mechanics of those tiny alveoli, we can move closer to providing safer, more personalized, and more effective breathing support.
I'm walking away from this deep dive with a renewed sense of awe for the intricate workings of the human body and a whole lot of hope for the future of respiratory care.
It's truly inspiring to witness the progress being made in this field as we continue to delve deeper into the mysteries of the lungs. Who knows what other groundbreaking discoveries await us?
So there you have it, folks.
Yeah.
We've taken a deep dive into the fascinating world of alveolar mechanics, explored cutting-edge research, and glimpsed the exciting possibilities that lie ahead. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about how our lungs work, the better equipped we are to protect them and breathe a little easier. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. Keep exploring, stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.